Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Gini Dietrich.
And Ginny, I think we should expand the scope of this podcast. I think we should
Love
start
it.
covering economic issues and engineering. And I don't know, while we're at it, why don't we do the arts?
Let's do some politics. I'd like to do some politics.
Oh, definitely politics. Yeah. I think that would
Smart.
be
I think
a
that's
good
really
expansion
smart.
of the scope of this.
Absolutely. Yes.
But we're still going to do it in just about 20 minutes a week. And we'll
choose
pay
a
ourselves
topic.
exactly the same amount.
Yes, absolutely. I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Let's
Cool.
do it.
Well, so that obviously is a joke. We're not doing any of those things.
No.
Although it might make it easier to come up with topics because some weeks we struggle to figure out what to talk about. And if we were covering everything, well, maybe it'd
It'd
just
be
make it even
super easy.
harder.
Although we could just record our pre-conversation and be done with it.
Yeah, we'd probably get in a lot of trouble though. So let's not do that, okay? Can we just agree
I'd have to tone down my swearing too.
We're not hitting record before we hit record. So that not serving any purposes at all.
Nope. I agree.
No.
Not good.
All right. Well, how about we talk about scope creep when it comes to agencies rather than this podcast?
I like it. And you just did a webinar on this. So tell us all.
Yeah. I mean, look, scope creep is something that I think just about every agency experiences at one point or another. I think I've talked in the past about my theory of the bell curve of profitability for agency clients, where you tend to be less profitable in the beginning because you're getting up to speed, and then you start to figure it out and you get efficient and you don't have to ask so many questions to get things done well. And then over time, that's when the scope creep comes in and starts driving down your profitability. And I think that part of the problem is that as agency leaders, we need to be thinking about scope from the very first conversation that we're having with a prospect. And so many of the problems that we talk about on this show go back to the first conversation with an employee or a client or something like that. And so we need to set the expectations correctly from the very beginning, because if we don't, we have no hope of staying within scope over time. But then we also have to set the expectations correctly in the actual documents we're signing.
Right.
And so it's a balancing act, because you don't want to be so specific in the agreement that you're constraining yourself from being able to be creative, or you're forcing yourself to do certain things or meet certain objectives that 6 months later will no longer make any sense. So you've got to have some flexibility in there. At the same time, you've got to put guardrails in.
Absolutely.
And you develop these by learning from your past engagements. If you do that, then you can set up the protections that you need in order to be able to have reasonable, rational conversations with your clients when scope creep occurs.
And I think we've had this conversation before too, in that we tend to build our scope before we really get into the client's business, especially when it's a brand new client, right? If you're doing scope after a year or something, it's a little bit easier. But when it's with a brand new client, you just don't know. You don't know what their culture is like. You don't know what access you're going to have. And we have a list of things, like you have to give us access to analytics and the CRM and, blah, 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 all your marketing automation, all the kinds of stuff, right? And we tend to add to that list based on what we've learned from other clients. But even still, you still don't know exactly what you're getting into. And so building a scope of work for an entire year, like I think most of us do, is really challenging. So one of the things that we started to do is say, okay, for the first 90 days, this is what we're going to do. We got to set you up. We got to do systems, all this stuff. We're going to get some results. These are the tangible deliverables you'll get in the first 90 days. After that, we're going to take a look at things and say, okay, what are the objectives? Where are our benchmarks? What were we able to accomplish in the first 90 days, and move from there? And we do that every quarter. So we're really only writing a scope for 3 months at a time. It's a pain in the butt from a paperwork standpoint, but it prevents the scope creep, because we're able to have that quarterly conversation to say, this worked, this didn't, we still need this, we weren't able to get that. Like, these are the kinds of things that we need to be able to do to move your business forward. And it's less confrontational. So you don't have to call and say, so we're running out of hours. Like, you don't have to have that conversation, because it's a consistent ongoing thing that's part of the work that you're doing with your clients.
Yeah, and communication like that is absolutely critical to staying within scope. And it's the communications breakdowns happen at multiple levels.
For sure.
In the worst cases of scope creep. And it tends to be because you're not communicating well with the client. But just as importantly, you're not communicating well with your own team.
Yep.
Far too often, the actual employees who are responsible for the day-to-day work have no idea what the scope is that you've committed to.
Right.
And they need to know that.
They need to know, yes.
Because are they still likely to veer outside of scope on occasion to keep a client happy? 100%.
Yep.
I mean, we just have to accept that employees are in a difficult spot. And I know that in the past, when I was a junior agency employee and I had the client asking for one thing and a boss telling me that I had to stay within a certain parameter of hours or scope or whatever, I was between a rock and a hard place because I knew someone was going to yell at me. And so the instinct is to try to find some way through, which usually ends up in at least some degree of overservicing. So that will still happen. But what you've got to do is you've got to make sure that they know that they're overservicing, because that will curb it to some degree or another. And when you hide things from your team, they don't have the information that they need, the awareness that they need in order to help you make better decisions.
Yeah, I remember, it was this a long time ago, but in the early days of my agency, I remember an employee pulling me aside and saying, "It's great that you're going to these new business meetings and you're writing the proposals and you're saving us from all of that work. But once we transition to doing the work, like we don't have the same knowledge that you have. And so the clients are getting frustrated. We're getting frustrated." And I was like, oh, and in my mind, I really was saving them from all that. Like it's administrative, tedious work. Right. But when in fact, and sure, it's still tedious and they didn't enjoy the actual proposal writing and stuff like that. But because they began to become involved from the beginning, they understood what it is that we've promised, what we've said that we can do, and to what extent that costs, right? So that became less of an issue too when I involved them from the beginning versus after the contract was signed.
Yeah, and you have to make sure that you're creating a culture that they will share with you when the client is asking for things.
Yep.
They're out of scope. Even if they may agree to it in the moment because it only takes 5 minutes, they still need to keep you in the loop. And if you are not getting the awareness yourself as the leader for what kind of scope creep is going on, you can't make a rational decision about how much to allow. Because I'm not going to tell you shouldn't allow any scope creep, because if every time the client asks for something out of scope, you call them up and say, "We're not doing this," or "You have to pay more," or something like that, you are going to destroy that relationship.
Absolutely. Yes.
So you cannot be that kind of agency. You need to accept that there is going to be some, but you need to be aware of it. You need to deal with it sooner rather than later when you've crossed that line into something where it is too much. Because if you don't call it out when it's happening, if you don't deal with it when it's small, it becomes really hard to deal with once you've got a huge accumulation of it that's built over 6, 9, 12 months or more. And so you've got to be in a position where you're just addressing it as soon as you possibly can so that you can get things back on track.
Yeah. I mean, a really good example of that just literally just happened here is a client asked 3 of my team members to be at their on-site in June for 3 days, with travel and all that. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. We're not budgeted for that. Like, we're not scoped for that at all. There's no travel. There's no in-person anything. So, and that's expensive. It's really expensive to have 3 people in one place for 3 days.
Yep.
So, luckily I think I've created a culture that it did come up, and I was like, okay, great that they want you there, but we've got to get a new scope of work or do an addendum to our contract, because that we just, if we take that out of our current budget, we can't do the work. And like my team, I didn't even realize it. It was just part of the conversation that we were having as a team update. And they were like, oh, so you like, to your point, you have to build a culture that people are comfortable sharing that with you and saying, the client's really excited to have us there. How do we make that happen?
Yeah.
It's like new scope of work, friends.
Right. And at the same time, in order to deal with sort of the less expensive scope creep that can occur, so that you're not making your client feel nickeled and dimed, you've got to build that into your original pricing.
Yes.
And so too often, just to win the business, I've seen agencies kind of whittle that pricing down to the bare minimum just to give what's being asked for. But you have to assume that there's going to be out of scope requests, because I don't think I've ever had an engagement as an agency where the client didn't ask for at least a little something out of scope. And we have to stop putting ourselves in this position where we think that the client is doing it for nefarious purposes. They're trying to get something for nothing.
No.
Frankly, most of the
They
time,
just
the
don't
person we're dealing with
realize.
on the client side doesn't even know what was
Yeah.
agreed to themselves
Right.
in the
Right.
beginning. So they may be completely clueless. And oftentimes my experience has been when you tell them, oh, that's not within scope, they'll be, oh, I had no idea. I'm
Right.
sorry. I didn't mean to
Right.
ask you to do something that
Right.
I thought it was quick and easy and was in scope and was fine. But make sure that you're building some sort of a cushion into your price so that you can allow those little things, sort of like if you're renovating your house or something like that. You want to build in a cushion so that when you want to move an outlet or something, you move the damn outlet.
Right.
And you don't have to worry about, oh my God, that's going to be another $500 to do that. Like,
Right.
just, plan ahead that these things are going to happen, and you'll be in a much better position to figure out what's the real scope creep, like travel expenses, that you need to deal with. Because anytime it's an out-of-pocket scope creep, that's a real.
It's
There's,
real.
there's a
Yeah.
difference between a little
Right.
extra time, which is
Right.
bad,
Yes.
but direct out-of-pocket expenses, that's much worse.
Not happening. Not happening.
Not happening.
You said something, moving an outlet. Shoot, I lost it.
I just distracted you
It'll
by
come
taking
back
you
to
off
me.
topic. Well, fortunately, we've built in a little cushion here in time,
Very
so we've
good,
got a little
very
bit of time
good.
that
Yeah,
we can come back to it when it re-registers in your mind. I think the other thing that we have to do is we have to create a culture of trust with the client, so that that they are open to us coming to them with these conversations. And so some of that's on the personal level. Some that means that as agency leaders and owners, we need to make sure we're maintaining a relationship with the client, even as we're having other
Yeah.
people run the day-to-day piece of it. Because generally speaking, when it comes to something like scope creep, that almost always ends up being a more senior conversation at some point. If you don't nip it immediately by the person on the other end saying, oh, I didn't realize it was in scope, let's just forget about it, let's move on. When it's something they really want or need and want to push forward, it's probably going to be more senior conversation. So you want to make sure that you've established that relationship of trust. But part of that too comes in those early expectations. And one of the things that I have always said to my clients in consulting engagements of any kind is, look, here's the price that we're agreeing on. But if at any point I feel like it's not working for me or you feel like it's not working for you, let's come to each other and we'll figure out what to do. Do we need to adjust scope? Do we need to adjust price? But I like to set that expectation before anything is signed. And frankly, it's another reason why I don't like true ironclad long-term contracts, because frankly, I want the flexibility
Absolutely.
on
Yeah.
my side
Yeah.
to go back and renegotiate when necessary.
Yep.
And I would rather that flexibility than the misguided, quote unquote, certainty of a long-term contract.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. What were some of the questions and topics that came up during the webinar that you just did?
So, I mean, the questions are typically around the logistics of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do I specifically have this conversation? How do I increase the price on someone who's, really budget sensitive, even when I know that what they're asking for is something that we ought to do? And I think these are things that we've touched on a lot in the past, particularly when it comes to raising prices on existing clients, right? Because that's the guide that I look to when it comes to scope creep. You have basically two choices. You can swap something out, and so we don't do this, but we do what you've just asked for instead. So we it's a net wash on the actual cost, or we are going to have to charge you more, but that's because you see as the client the additional value coming to you in exchange for whatever additional pay that you're getting. I think that we can't be in a position where we think about scope creep solely in terms of we need to charge you more for this. Frankly, more often than not, we can just rearrange what we're already doing for a client, particularly if it's scope creep that's happening over time, because chances are if it's come into the relationship a year or two down the road, there's something that we were doing originally that we're still doing. We could probably just shed that and it would, come out in the wash.
Yeah.
So, a lot of the questions really come down to those logistics of how do you actually have those conversations? How do you figure out how to price it? Those sorts of things.
Yeah. One of my favorite approaches is, absolutely. We can do this. We've been doing this, and this. What do you want to replace it with? I think we could probably replace it with this, and just make a recommendation. And sometimes the client will say, no, I want to keep doing that. What will it cost to add that on? And other times they're like, let's take your recommendation and replace it. So it's not technically scope creep because to your point, you're moving things around.
Right. And we also shouldn't assume that the answer is going to be no.
Right.
because I can't tell you how many times I've assumed that if I say this will cost this extra, someone will say, no, I'm gonna pass on that. The reality is that people say yes to these upcharges all the time.
Yep.
In some of the photography that I do on the side, I've been shocked at the people who will pay exorbitant travel fees for me on what is a relatively low cost project to begin with. In some cases, the travel cost may double the total cost of the engagement. And they're like, oh, that's
Crazy.
fine. I'm like,
Okay.
okay. I mean, I figured it was going to scare you away and I wouldn't have to do this cruddy thing that I wasn't interested in, but apparently not.
Okay. What's interesting about the last few episodes we've done is much of the things that we're talking about really come down to understanding your financials and getting that straight. And I think if you have that foundation, a lot of the stuff goes away, right? Because you know how much things cost, you know what your profitability needs to be, and you know where things stand. And if you have that really strong foundation, and I'm not saying you necessarily have to do it, but you do have to find an accountant who can help you create these kinds of things. Once you understand that, all of this stuff gets easier. Prospecting gets easier, pricing gets easier, price increases get easier, scope creep gets easier, all of it gets easier. I think too many of us, myself included in the past, have just focused on, well, I think it'll cost this and let's just throw it in there. And that's where the scope creep comes into play, is when we don't do it based on actual numbers.
Yeah, I mean, look, the two best solutions are the two best solutions that I recommend for almost every operating problem within an agency. The first is regular, without fail, weekly one-on-ones with all direct reports.
Yep.
Right? Because that's your line of communication internally, so that you're even aware that something's up that you need to pay attention to. And the second is project budgeting, because if you're doing the time tracking that's required for project budgeting and you're looking at your numbers, you'll understand when and where you need to draw the line on scope creep. And so almost every single internal operations problem I've ever encountered in an agency can be, if not completely solved, heavily mitigated by those two things.
Totally agree. Absolutely. Yes.
And the vast majority of agencies aren't doing either.
That's correct. Because it's time and uncomfortable and things that you don't want to focus on. That's
but
absolutely
both
right.
Are actually really easy to do and don't take all that much time. And if you just invested in them, it would make a monumental difference.
Yes.
In the outcomes. And frankly, it even bleeds over onto the business development side, because it helps you to figure out what kinds of clients you want to get, how to price them effectively, and maybe even bubbles up some ideas of who to specifically target if you're doing those one-on-ones well.
Yes, absolutely. One-on-ones, do your project budgeting. So many things will be solved. So many problems will be solved.
Yeah. And on the client side, communications, same thing. Yep. I mean, we are in the business of communications, and yet we are generally very bad at communicating with clients, with team members, with prospects. The only thing we're good at is advising others on their communications, but we need to focus on our own shoes a little bit as the cobbler.
Do, yes, as the cobbler needs to do, 100%. So,
any final words on scope creep, or should we try to contain the scope of this podcast?
I think we should try to contain the scope of this episode.
Okay. Well, on that note, then, I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And it depends.